Welcome back, America, to this special episode of Life, Liberty, and Levin, as we take a look back at some of the great patriots we've had on our show this year. The handling, or should I say mishandling, of the dire situation on our southern border is one of the biggest blunders of the Biden administration and only continues to get worse. Stephen Miller has some ideas on how to fix the problem. Go. This issue of the border. According to the Marxist left, which has heavy representation throughout our media, particularly MSNBC and CNN, should President Trump win the presidency, you should do nothing about all the people who've come into our country. Millions and millions and millions of people. We know terrorists have been stopped. You have to assume some got through. We know the drug cartels are present in every state, in every metropolitan area. We know that tens of thousands of women have been sold into sex trafficking. Little kids have been sold into sex trafficking. The New York Times even did a piece months ago about 85,000 young teenagers who basically are slave labor throughout our corporate and business environment in this country. And this has all been done because Joe Biden has allowed it. My question to you, sir, is this. Under our Constitution, you commit a high crime if you defy federal statutes, if you take steps that do not protect the national security of the country. That is a high crime. That is what the framers meant. I know, I went back and looked. This one's not even in dispute. I'm not even talking about money or anything else. Should not this be one of the major issues when and if the House Republicans take up the issue of impeaching President Biden?
It is absolutely critical that articles of impeachment be sent from the House to the Senate for both Mayorkas and Biden for their conspiracy to commit human trafficking, drug trafficking, smuggling, illegal immigration, and the violation of dozens of federal immigration statutes. Now, people will say, well, they have federal immunity for these crimes. That's the reason why the impeachment process is so essential. You must use the impeachment process to hold them accountable and remove them from power.
When you watch Joe Biden relentlessly talk to Israel behind their backs to other countries and apparently to Netanyahu and the government of Israel, claiming concern about citizens in Gaza. How seriously can you take a man who could, in 24 hours, reverse course on what he's doing on the southern border and protect the citizens of the United States? Why is it that he's so focused on the Jewish state and not focused on his own state?
Well, there is a disease in the mind of the American left that fundamentally disallows, prohibits any feeling of support for national sovereignty here in America, any affinity for America as a coherent nation state, the idea that America has inherent interests in controlling who can and cannot enter the country, in controlling the flow of immigration. All of these thoughts have been banished by the modern left to the point in which the left celebrates it as a virtue to flood this country with millions of unknown masses, to demolish and unravel our institutions, to break down social trust, to break down community bonds, all of the things that happen when you take a city or a place and then overnight transform it with countless people who speak a different language, have a different cultural value set, have a fundamentally different way of looking at the world with no process for assimilation, no process for integration. Not to mention the fact that their very being here is an act of criminal trespass, compounded by one crime after another: stealing a Social Security number, working illegally, failing to pay taxes, crimes that are amnestied through the inaction of DOJ, through the deliberate inaction of the Department of Labor and Homeland Security, that if committed by an American citizen would have them ruined, They would be in jail, their businesses stolen, their livelihoods taken. So American citizens are forced to watch not only as their communities are changed without their consent, but the laws that they must comply with and the taxes that they must hand over are not taken or taxed from the illegal aliens, and those laws are not applied to those illegal aliens. It is a two-track society. Citizens live under one set of rules. Illegal aliens are exempt from every rule.
Well said, and I do find it interesting that Biden and the media and their Democrats never tell us when enough is enough, when too many is too many. They never put a number because they don't want a number. And I also find it interesting and not coincidental, purposeful, that the same people who hate our country, whether they be in the media, the Democrat Party, or elsewhere, in our colleges and universities, tenured professors, who trash our history, who trash our founding, who trash capitalism, are the same people who want the borders wide open to import people from different cultures. And you mentioned assimilation. It's harder and harder to assimilate into a country that's destroying its own culture. And many of the same people who insist on these open borders insist that we destroy our own culture, so there's nothing to assimilate into. I want to thank you, Stephen Miller, for all the hard work you're doing, and I'm very, very sorry that you have to be a target of such racist,
something like From the River to the Seaman.
anti-Semitic individuals throughout the
Called
media.
something like
yourself.
From the River to the
Thank you,
Seaman.
Mark.
I'm not
And
sure, but
it's a small but unfortunate
that's just an
price to pay
idea.
to be able to
That's
have
just
this
an
platform
idea.
like I have with you today to fight for what's right and just in America.
When we return, my buddy Stephen A. Smith talks sports and politics. We'll be right back.
Welcome to Fox News Live. I'm Claudia Cowan in New York. Police are investigating a swatting call targeting Maine's Secretary of State, Shenna Bellows. Police say an unknown man called them Friday night claiming he broke into her home. But when cops arrived, they found no one inside. The fake emergency call coming just a day after Bellows ruled former President Trump is constitutionally ineligible to appear on Maine's 2024 primary ballot. Bellows joins a growing list of politicians who've recently been swatted. A top U.S. naval commissioner is issuing a serious warning that Iran-backed Houthi rebels show no sign of ending their attacks on commercial ships in the Red Sea. The news coming even as more countries join an international maritime mission to protect vessels in the vital waterway. Houthis claim they're targeting Israel-linked ships to stop the fighting in Gaza. I'm Claudia Cowan. Now back to Life, Liberty, and...
Welcome back, America. Well, I hope you're enjoying the holiday season. And a few months ago, I caught up with my buddy Stephen A. Smith, who told me all about politics in the world of sports. Here's what he had to say. Go. We have a good friend of mine, Stephen A. Smith. You know, Stephen A. Smith, I'm glad you're here. People say, why do you talk about him? Why are you friends with him? I don't understand that question. Do I have to be friends only with people who agree with me? Hell, my wife doesn't agree with me all the time. My wife, who you know, it's just ridiculous.
Yes.
But tell people why we're friends, why we get along.
Well, first of all, I had the pleasure of meeting you years ago at a radio convention, and I've always found you to be somebody who tells it like you see it. And you know where Mark Levin is coming from, whether you like it or not. And that's something, obviously, we have in common. We speak our mind. We speak what we believe our truth is and should be, and we go with it from there. And if we disagree, we can disagree without being disagreeable, which is what this world should be all about. So it doesn't matter to me whether our politics agree or don't agree. I know I respect the hell out of you. I know that's reciprocated, and that's how friendships are made as far as I'm concerned.
You have a great new podcast, Stephen A. Smith Show, podcast on YouTube. You've got First Take, outstanding show on ESPN. You also have a wonderful book, Straight Shooter, that was on the New York Times bestseller list for 2.5 months, for crying out loud. That's a long time.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you want to kind of spread beyond sports. You don't want to eliminate sports. You don't want to leave it behind. That's your bread and butter. That's your wheelhouse. You're the Rain Man in sports, as far as I'm concerned. I can ask you any question. You'll say, well, 1974. And I'm going, whoa, what the hell? But anyway, so But the truth is, you want to get involved in the culture, politics to a point in society, because you have thoughts about that too. And if I'm correct, I believe you've told me you're not a Republican, you're not a Democrat, you're an independent, you've voted both ways before. You have an open mind about candidates. So when you're watching, without getting in the names, when you're thinking about candidates and so forth, what do you want in a candidate?
Competence, knowledge, but more importantly than anything else, particularly when it comes to the presidency, statesmanship. I want somebody that understands that they're overseeing and they're governing all the people, not just their constituency, and they're putting America first, not just their own specific interests. As a voter, we may tend to do that, obviously, for the most part, whether your position is immigration, abortion, the economy, the list goes on and on. As a voter, you may have a monolithic view in terms of those things, or certainly where your passion lies. But when you are an elected official, your job is to do what you perceive to be in the best interest of the country. And obviously, from time to time, that varies. There's not a direct monolithic view to take at all times as far as I'm concerned. But I think statesmanship goes a long way towards that and putting America first as opposed to our own individual self-interest. There's a lot of decisions as an individual that I may make that I might believe is in my best interest. But if I were the president of the United States, if I was a senator, if I was a congressional figure, then it would be, I would take into account my constituency and most importantly, what's in the best interest of the whole as opposed to small individual parts. That's what I believe governing is all about, and that's what I take into consideration anytime I'm voting for someone.
Now, you're not an ideologue. You've told me that. You like to look at issues. You might go with a Republican. You might go with a Democrat. But in that, you're in the minority, aren't you? Because a lot of the hosts in sports tend to be Democrats, tend to be left-wing, not all, but a lot of them. A lot of the athletes, particularly depending on what the sport is, same thing. Do you ever discuss politics or anything other than sports when you're not on air with these folks?
Well, sometimes they try to get a little bit out of hand, and then I check them. That's what I do. Certainly when they try to debate with me, I'm ready for it. If I'm not knowledgeable about something, I'm open and honest about it. If I believe I am knowledgeable about it, then I'll express that knowledge. But more importantly than anything else, the issue of fairness comes into play. And a lot of times when you see people like yourself, or Sean Hannity on the right, or others on the left, or what I consider to be a left centrist, somebody like Chris Cuomo and others, I take into account not just your knowledge, but where you're coming from and why you feel the way that you feel. A lot of times when we see people and they're dogged in their beliefs, this one thing to express that doggedness with the level of adamance and emphasis that you may place on it, a lot of times what I take into consideration is what is coming from the other side and how you're warding that off. The fact that there are people who are unreasonable, who won't lean on facts and elect to lean on emotion and elect to lean on preference or ideology as opposed to what's in the best interest of the whole. These are all the things that I analyze, and I take all of those things into consideration depending on who I'm talking to. And the more reasonable somebody is, the more I'm apt to listen to them because, number one, they're making sense, and number two, they're expressing and disseminating a strong interest in being fair and fair-minded. And when that is the case, I think those are the kind of people you want on Capitol Hill, because those are the kind of people that can talk to Mark Levin and they could go on CNN or vice versa. They don't have to stay on one side because they understand their position is somewhat universal to some degree, and it's in the best interest of the whole. And when that's the case, it's hard for anybody to look at you and question your intent. And when they don't get to question your intent, then it's hard for them to argue with anything other than.
Senior fellow, City Journal contributing editor, this man has been fighting, I'd say for decades, to draw America's attention to CRT and how the radical left are destroying our culture. And now he's put it in a fabulous book, America's Culture Revolution, How the Radical Left Conquered Everything. Christopher Rufo, really terrific book. Let me ask you a question. They control the culture now, don't they?
They do, and this is part of a long-standing campaign on the left. You know, in the late 60s and early 70s, the radical left thought they could violently overthrow the U.S. government. That certainly collapsed during the Nixon administration. Then they devised a new plan, the Long March through the Institutions, taking control of all of our elite cultural production from the inside. And that's exactly what we've done. This book traces it from the beginnings, the origins in the late 1960s, all the way to the explosion and really the revelation of these trends during the summer of George Floyd. And so it's not by accident that conservatives feel besieged. They see Marxist ideology in all of these institutions. This is part of a plan, something that I really work to expose in the book.
And this plan was really developed by Italian communists, by German communists that had an enormous influence on our communists and our universities and colleges that you point out here. The plan was to not violently overthrow America or any democracy, although that would be great if you could. But tell me if I'm wrong. They said, look, the proletariat, the people are not going to rise up and overthrow this place. Lenin said it has to be top down. And Gramsci and these others said, we got to conquer their cultural institutions. And isn't that exactly what they're doing?
Yeah, that's exactly right. In fact, in the 1970s, the top neo-Marxist philosopher Herbert Marcuse wrote explicitly that the working class and the middle class in the United States was not just non-revolutionary, but anti-revolutionary, meaning most middle-class Americans and working-class Americans were happy with the country, happy with its principles. And so they said we need to lead an elite revolution that unites the intellectuals on university campuses and the underclass in the inner cities to put pressure in two ways on the American public and to launder these revolutionary and radical ideas through the institutions. And so these are explicitly anti-American. They're explicitly anti-capitalist. And in some cases, they have a racial dialectic that is explicitly anti-white. They see that as a potent rallying cry for their revolutionary movement. And when you see the evidence from 2020, you kind of look back on that in astonishment. You realize it's just been a cycle that's been repeating for decades. There are really no surprises. You have to pin it down, see where it comes from if you want to hope to defeat it.
I'll tell you what I love about your book, which, by the way, you can get at Amazon.com, America's Cultural Revolution. I have people come up to me all the time and say, how did we lose our classrooms? Why? How did we lose our language here? How did we lose women's sports? And you go through it and you explain it. So how did we lose it all?
Well, the education system is key. I mean, look, Marxists and radicals all over the world know that in order to control the future of a country, you have to control the transmission of values. And the transmission of values in a large public school system like we have in the United States comes in the public school classroom. So they were very explicit. They got first 100 neo-Marxist intellectuals working in the field of education in the universities. And then they spread their ideas through the K through 12 bureaucracy. And what they've done brilliantly is then concretize and force those ideas through so-called diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, to the point where now what I've discovered is that the Marxist revolutionary literature of the late 1960s from radicals like the Black Panther Party and the Weather Underground is now exactly the